All I know is that I came around not feeling great, probably about a day later. And in that period, my wife and kids had been taken into a room by the doctor, first of all, and told that I wasn't going to make it, to prepare themselves, that I wasn't going to make it. I was going to die. Sometime afterwards, maybe the next day, they were told, well, we think he might well make it, but if he does, he'll be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, and we don't know how much cognition he'll have. Basically, I could have been a vegetable in a wheelchair was the effect of what they were saying.
Hello and welcome to Crisis, What Crisis? I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 7 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success, but there are far, far fewer where you can benefit from the experiences of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis. But you'll also hear from renowned crisis managers, mental health and performance experts, and advisors who were in the room when major crises have hit. All of them offering useful, practical coping techniques and tips, and all with the straightforward aim of guiding you towards a more resilient approach to life and whatever it might throw at you. Crisis, What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream. That's Mind with a Y, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. If you enjoy what you hear today, please subscribe and give us a rating and review. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our handle is at Crisis What Crisis Podcast. My guest today, I am thrilled to say, is one of Britain's best broadcasters, the brilliant Andrew Marr. Perhaps best known for his Sunday morning politics show, which he recently left after more than 20 years. Andrew is a true polymath, a man who can not only present, but who writes prolifically, is a talented painter, and who's forgotten more than most of us have learned about Britain's history. Andrew is also a survivor. In 2013, he suffered a catastrophic stroke that his wife and children were told would claim his life. He defied his doctors, of course, although has been left with permanent paralysis on his left side. Then 4 years ago, Andrew was diagnosed with kidney cancer. He battled that challenge away with determination and self-deprecation. This is not a man to wallow in his own troubles, I can tell you. But he has analysed and made sense of those crises and talks in this podcast about them in a way that is both fascinating and I think valuable. After the stroke, my life became a long list of can'ts, he says. Can't run, can't cycle, can't swim, can't ski. I decided instead to concentrate on the cans, and I now try to squeeze the juice out of every day. Brilliant. This is a compelling episode with a truly compelling guest. My thanks to him, and I hope you enjoy it. Andrew Marr, thank you for joining me today. How are you, sir?
I'm pretty fair, I think is the best way I could describe it. It's a slightly cloudy, slightly chilly day, but otherwise I'm fine.
Very good. You're a little way now into the new job at LBC, unleashed from the shackles at the BBC.
Yeah.
I assume you're enjoying it.
I am working twice as hard and having 3 times as much fun, which means the maths are good.
That new freedom, from the kind of impartiality.
Yeah.
Problem, if you can put it that way, allows you, I suppose, to take a different approach to crisis. You've had a front row seat in so many political crises over so many years.
I think I can be sharper in what I say and clearer. If we're talking just after Keir Starmer has been forced to say that he would resign if given a fixed penalty notice after so-called Beergate. Mm-hmm. On things like that at the BBC, and for reasons I completely respect and understand, I would have to lean over backwards to see all sides of the case and put it as neutrally as possible. But with my new freedom, as you put it, I'm able to say much more clearly where I think he, and in particular his office, fouled up in the handling of all of this, how serious it is, how serious I think it is not, and whereas so I can just be clearer, and I think a bit straighter with my audience.
Yeah. Do you think the word itself, crisis, is overused?
Certainly, yes. Everything becomes a crisis. It's a cost of living crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's a new political crisis. It is an endlessly overused word. Anyone who's gone through a personal crisis knows that what you're going through feels very different from the normal rough and tumble or cut and thrust of politics or business or office life. And so I think we use it overmuch, far too much in public speech. We need a series of synonyms for it, for which we don't have.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Problem doesn't quite cut it, does it? You know. What qualifies as a crisis, do you think? We'll get onto the personal side of it, but in the political context, what qualifies as a crisis in your mind?
In the political context, it's what happens when generally something that has been bubbling under for a very, very long time breaches the surface in such a way that the people involved have to take fast and, frankly, painful decisions to resolve it. It's the best bit. If we're talking about the Partygate or Beergate period in British politics, quite clearly during the lockdown, millions of people were wrestling with quite restrictive rules, finding it hard to meet loved ones, hard to socialize. And I'm sure all around the country, people were edging or indeed breaking those rules, but many weren't. And so the fact that that was going on in Number 10, the fact that politicians up and down the country were meeting for a beer and a curry and doing this and doing that, which perhaps strictly speaking, by the most rigorous application of the rules, they shouldn't have been. That was something that was bubbling under for a very, very long time. And then suddenly it becomes apparent that the police are investigating in Number 10. The thing arrives in Prime Minister's questions again and again and again and again. What had been a subterranean issue becomes a public one. And the thing that happens is an irritated student ambling along in the dusk outside a building in Durham, picks up his mobile phone and takes a very quick video of a window because he can see in silhouette a recognizable figure there. Now, the consequences of that we still don't know, but it might change the entire shape of British politics. So it's when small things suddenly become big things and can't be avoided any longer.
Yeah. Who's impressed you over the years with their handling, with their crisis handling skills? Who, when you've seen them kind of in the, never mind their politics, but just in the practical handling of a very difficult moment, who's impressed you and why?
Well, a lot of this is about temperament, I think. I always think temperament is fate. You can criticize people endlessly for lacking self-awareness, but there is a certain kind of rubbery resilience around some politicians. And I'd include Tony Blair, I'd include Boris Johnson, I'd include, for instance, Matt Hancock. You know, the bullets, the sharp objects seem just to bounce off them. Yes. And the smile remains and the air of relaxation remains. And sometimes for an outsider, for a journalist, it's quite irritating. You think you should be in pain here. You should be really struggling here. But take Boris Johnson under assault I always enjoy watching the videos of Boris Johnson being done over by Susanna Reid or Beth or whoever. It's the expression on his face, which is indescribable. And it's a mixture of pain, annoyance, embarrassment, and a kind of rueful acceptance that this is part of the gig. He handles that quite well. Matt Hancock bounced back from something that would have humiliated and destroyed most people, like some sort of Duralux bunny thing, you know.
Tiggerish, like resilience. Yes.
Resilience, absolutely unabashed, straight back into it. Perhaps a little bit too fast, some of us might say, but nonetheless quite well. I think Keir Starmer, who I spoke to yesterday, has an expression of wearied pain across his face. I think he's finding it very, very difficult, very painful. It may well be that he is not, therefore, one of those natural politicians with that rubbery resilience I was talking about.
Yeah, he looks a bit baffled as well.
He looks surprised. He looks as if the world has become impertinent around him suddenly, and that look. So don't get me wrong. I don't admire at a human level the rubbery resilience. In a sense, we all have to react and be honest about what's happening around us. But if you're going to be a successful politician in the endless, sweaty, groaning cage fight of British politics, you need that. And so therefore, as a professional observer, in a very strictly professional sense, I acknowledge and admire that.
Yes. You've worked closely with a number of prime ministers. If you could make a sort of composite PM with all the best bits, how would it be made up, do you think? I mean, Gordon Brown's temperament, I assume, would not figure.
It would
maybe Boris's brass neck would, I suspect. But who, that Frankenstein's monster, as it probably would be, would include which parts?
That's a really interesting thing. So going back over all the prime ministers I've covered and interviewed and so forth, I would say that Thatcher's absolutely clear ideological sense of direction, knowing who you are, where you're going, what you're going to have to do, even if it's difficult, even if you're going to offend people, from left or right, wherever it comes from, that sense of I know where I'm going is very, very important indeed. I think with John Major, a certain humility, the ability to understand that you might be wrong, a certain doggedness, perhaps, and
the backstory as well, perhaps. You'd want that, yeah.
Quite right. You'd want to come from somewhere outside the bubble, and be able to talk about it. And actually, people don't remember this, and because he's got this reputation for being grey. But Major could be quite funny, particularly about himself. He's quite dry and so a certain dry wit. With Tony Blair, I would say optimism. Tony always had, and still has an essential optimism, not just about human nature, but about the ability of societies like ours to literally advance and progress and become better. So you need to think that things can get better. They may get worse, but they can get better. And that by working in politics, pulling the levers that you've got, you can make things better. That's absolutely essential. And weirdly, because they're such different characters, I think Boris Johnson has a bit of that optimism too. He believes in the end there'll be spills and trouble ahead and people will shout and he'll get into trouble. But in the end, it'll be better. He's like some sort of vessel which keeps getting capsized and rights itself again and again. So you need that optimism.
They both share the same thickness of skin as well, in different ways, but don't they?
I think Tony's skin is a bit thinner actually than Boris Johnson's, and that's because perhaps he has a little bit more self-knowledge and self-awareness than the current Prime Minister, and also unlike Boris Johnson, I think Tony Blair's worldview is very much underpinned by religious faith. I mean, he does believe in God. He does believe in judgment. He does think about these things. I suspect that BJ doesn't.
No, you don't get that impression.
You mentioned Gordon Brown's temperament, and that would not be in the top 10 list. But his appetite for hard work, his concentration on details certainly would. Not we can say at the moment is going on, but I think Gordon's ability to absorb huge amounts of information, crunch his way through it, and come out with the clear lessons or policies, decisions that emerge from that is really impressive. And, we are a short attention span, slightly heedless society maybe these days. And I think we should be admiring more of people who just genuinely work very hard, get up in the morning, do the job, focus on the details, don't get distracted, don't go down the pub too early, all of that. And that would be the Gordon bit of the story, I reckon.
I agree with that. On crisis, though, just to bring it back to crisis, Gordon was, in one sense, he could see the big picture, certainly with the financial crisis. But for when he was facing individual or rather personal crisis, pretty unable really to see the big picture, unable to kind of get out of the moment and get perspective, and took things very personally when he was in those moments of difficulty. Unable really to distance himself from it. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. For somebody who increasingly looked more and more and more like a bull elephant, that great sort of leathery face, that heavy demeanor, he had a thin skin. And I think his anger was often self-directed. He knew he had a great intellect. He knew his values were right. And by the way, after leaving Number 10, he has behaved impeccably as a former. He's
totally agree. Yeah.
Former prime minister than ever was a prime minister.
Admirable. Yeah.
Done the right thing and all of that. But then when things weren't happening as he wanted, he would blame people around him for sure. And he shouted and threw things and all of that. But I think it was frustration. I'm Gordon Brown. This is my moment. I can change things, but things aren't working for the country isn't understanding me. That must be my fault, but I can't change that. He'd have that easy sort of easiness with himself, which would allow him to flop onto a Sunday morning television sofa and explain himself in a frank and engaging way. He couldn't do that. And I think he was frustrated by that too.
Yes. Andrew, you're known quite rightly as a brilliant broadcaster, but you were a newspaper man first and foremost, of course. A stellar career that leads to the editorship of The Independent in the late 90s, when you're in your 30s. But then a pretty painful and public exit. Not as painful and public as mine, I have to tell you. In fact, as I was preparing for this chat today, and very much looking forward to it, I reminded myself that I suppose the high point of my editing career was when I was given the Newspaper of the Year award. And the man who presented me with that was you. And it was downhill from that moment on.
I'm sorry.
So you are the journalistic high point for me, just as an aside. But back to you and The Independent. I mean, you've been very sort of self-effacing about your editing career, but that must have been a very difficult time, I imagine.
Extremely difficult time. I was living in the far west of London, East Sheen, and The Independent was in the relatively far east. It was in Canary Wharf, in that great big tower in the centre of Canary Wharf, which might seem a strange way to start this explanation, but it involved, in the days of heavy traffic, often a 2-hour car journey to work, and then an hour. So it was very, very long days when you'd be sitting in the back of the car, feeling queasy, going through all the other newspapers, spitting blood about the stories that we had missed or had been treated better by. In those days, The Guardian, under Alan Rusbridge, was at its prime, and they were frankly caning us. They had a much, much bigger staff, much bigger resources, but they were doing really well. And so I'd be sort of sitting there brooding over all the failures of the previous day, arrive at work, feeling nauseous, exhausted already, and kind of crumpled, and go straight into meetings with the advertising team. The commercial people were saying, we're not selling enough of this. We could cut our price in the auctions if that lifts this. The advertising, we need more advertising pages. And I say, no, you can't have any more space. Editorial needs that. So you had all those bruising arguments. Mm-hmm. And then the big problem that we had was that the paper was owned by not one, but two people or organizations, more or less exactly equal shares. They both had about 49% of the newspaper. And of course, they had not just subtly, but very different views of what it should be. So I had Tony O'Reilly, who I must say I always really liked, who was the owner of the Irish Independent Group, big tycoon at that time. His empire has since fallen apart, but they're a very big, successful tycoon figure. And he wanted a strongly pro-European, indeed pro-Euro, serious broadsheet newspaper, which was lots and lots and lots of heavy policy discussion on broadsheet pages, not too many pictures. And the only bit of light relief would be a great deal of coverage of Irish rugby. So that was his view of the. And then there was David Montgomery, O'Reilly, south of Ireland, Catholic, gregarious, funny, cultured. David Montgomery, Ulsterman, north of Ireland, very fascinated by the numbers. I think it's fair to say slightly more narrow in his worldview. he was absolutely sure, having come from News International, where you were, that he wanted to recreate today, in effect. And he wanted a tabloid, mid-market newspaper focused on busy, wealthy, successful people. He kept telling me we want lots more stories about people having their Rolexes stolen in West London. That's the kind of one. So and also, skeptical about the EU in any way. So very, very different views of the paper. And as editor, I was piggy in the middle, trying uselessly to sort of triangulate those positions. And so there would be lots and lots of arguments with the owners and between the owners while I was editor. The only thing that they could agree on was that it must be possible to produce a national newspaper for even less money than we were. And so there would then be lots and lots of negotiations with the NUJ, people coming in tears to my office saying, I've lost my job. I don't understand. I thought you admired what I was doing. We can't.
Just a miserable existence, really.
And that's before you start to edit the newspaper.
Yes, indeed.
Decisions taken about what's. And I enjoyed very much deciding about the front page. I enjoyed very much talking to the various teams, trying to kind of whip up a columnist, go a little bit further to make more of a splash. I loved all of that. But I made one huge strategic mistake or error, which compounded my position and ultimately led to me being fired, which was that I thought that if I redesigned the paper radically, it would be such a shock that the owners would be forced for the first time under my editorship to give me some advertising, give me some promotion, get it out there and actually back the paper, which is what, in my view, they needed to do. And so I brought in a designer who knew nothing about newspapers at all, but had been a very, very successful designer of magazines, of shops, clothes, and you name it, everything but newspapers. And I said, if you were starting again and you knew nothing about the newspaper trade, what would you do? And he said, well, I can't understand why you get political stories scattered through the paper. Bring all the politics together. Lots of people are interested in the environment. So bring all the environmental stories together. Have areas where there's crime stories. And so we did that and we changed the typeface and all of that. And then we talked about the front page. And I said, well, so what is a front page? And those, it's a picture and it tells you what you really need to know. So we got rid of the idea of a splash story. Every day I would write a sort of 300 or 400 word piece, which said, these are the essential things you need to know today. And then I would get some very beautiful or memorable picture to splash right across this big broadsheet front page. And I thought it looked beautiful. I thought it was a really interesting new take on newspapers. But one, it was too radical. It was too much of a shock. The way the thing was organized and the way it looked was too much of a shock. And two, my naive belief that the owners would put money behind it was entirely wrong. They both folded their arms and sat back and it plunged and it was a disaster. And it was my disaster. And so I wasn't at all surprised. And I was even quite relieved by the time I was sacked. The weird thing that was happening, so I was defenestrated, which when you're 26 floors up in Canary Wharf, is painful. It's a long way down. And
literally and metaphorically.
Exactly. And then I went on holiday and I had a kind of not mental breakdown, but physical breakdown. I got very, very ill on holiday. I had terrible high blood pressure and the sweats and all the rest of it. And in the middle of that, lying on a Caribbean beach, not feeling at all happy to be there, I got a call from the O'Reilly side of the operation, which said, we've decided to buy out the other lot. You were right, we have to have a clear direction. Would you come back? Rosie Boycott had been put in as editor. They then got rid of it. They brought me back. I should never have said yes. And in the end, I think by the time I came back, although I was editor, Tony O'Reilly didn't have complete faith in me. I had fantastically interesting conversations with him and with Ben Bradley, the iconic Washington Post editor who was part of the board, and others. But they probably realized something that was true, which was that we have in our trade in journalism a horrible habit of taking people who are good at writing or are good reporters, good at getting stories, and making them editors. And actually, big organization is a management job. You need to understand management. You need to understand money flow. You need to understand the psychology of dealing with the big stuff. All those things they do teach you at business school, but people like me weren't taught.
Exactly right. Yeah.
The big problems in British journalism and actually in British society more generally, including politics, is that people who are good at one thing are immediately promoted to do something that they have never been trained to do. And so I was defenestrated, I was refenestrated, and then I was defenestrated. So it happened to me twice. And I think that is unique in the history of Fleet Street.
Did it feel like a crisis to you at the time? I mean, did you think to your, in your head, are you saying, well, what on earth am I going to do? What on earth am I going to do now?
It was sort of out of body experience. I don't know if you ever felt the same thing, but when I got the what they did was when I got the letter saying that I was dismissed, and my secretary brought it into my office. She looked very upset and embarrassed and said, "You've got to go, and there are some guys here who will deal with everything else." I said, "What do you mean deal with everything else?" "Well, all your computer, your books, your photographs, they were all put into black plastic bags. They were taken down in the lift with me and then dumped on the pavement where there was a car to take me home. And I was told that I could go back home, but I must not approach anybody from the organisation. All my friends were members of the staff. They were my friends, but I couldn't call them. I couldn't speak to them. And I couldn't, I think, go within 2 miles of the newspaper office under pain of losing any severance deal at all. So it was a really strange experience. And
it's where politics and journalism do kind of collide, really, in a way, because an exit as a minister is very similar to an exit as an editor, isn't it? It's the full black bin treatment, black bin bag, treatment. And I've never really understood why. It's a good example of where extra drama is inserted into a situation where it's not really required. Because if they come down and said, "Andrew, it's all over, would you mind leaving?" you would have said, "Of course."
Absolutely. It was done in this very, very heavy-handed way. And I can remember talking, I think it was to Malcolm Rifkind, after he was fired, or he left government. He wasn't fired. They lost office and he left. And I said, what's the strangest thing for you? He said, "Well, cars keep passing me in the street and I expect them to stop and the back doors to open for me too." And it's a bit like that, because a newspaper, like a junior politician, not that he was, tends to live in a sort of, you're looked after. There is a bubble, you're expensive, the way you move around the place. I can remember Charlie Wilson, who was working with me at the time, his driver used to send his shirts out for dry cleaning, and if he had to have a haircut, that was all sorted for him. Holidays everything is arranged. Live in this weird, utterly unreal bubble. And I think it's the same for politicians who are successful. And then it's taken away, and you stagger out into the wasteland, and you look around you, and you remember there's things called money and bills, and the rest of life that everybody else has.
Stamps. Yes. Yes, exactly right. I've talked about this a bit in the past and described it as editoritis, that kind of bubble that you just described. But it's right. It's ministeritis as well. They suffer from exactly the same
and
problem.
You pick the phone to ask your secretary to do something, and then you realise you don't have a secretary, and so no.
Yeah. You of course reinvented yourself pretty rapidly and very effectively, to put it mildly, joining the BBC as a political broadcaster. Amazing career thereafter on screen. But can we fast forward to 2013? And you're at the top of your game at this point, absolutely working at full tilt, and you suffer an appalling stroke. The result, in part, of having pushed yourself so hard, sort of at work. If you don't mind, Andrew, would you just tell me about that morning, if you don't mind?
Okay, absolutely. Well, everything you say there is true. The way I would put it is that I was like somebody who's just been given a Lamborghini and had put the foot down on the floor and was going as fast as I could. At some point, it was clearly going to end in a terrible crash, but you're enjoying the speed so much you can't take your foot off the accelerator pedal.
Give me a flavour. Give me a flavour of that. The average day. I mean,
at that period, I was political editor of the BBC. It was going well. No, I wasn't. I'm telling a lie. I'd ceased to be a political editor. I was doing my Sunday morning show, of course, but that was going well. But I was also, because the BBC wanted it, doing lots of documentary series. So I'd done the history of modern Britain. I was about to do the making of modern Britain. I was doing a three-parter on the Queen. I'd just finished that. And I was doing the history of the world, because I'm not ambitious. And both the history of the world and the Queen came with big, heavy books. So I was doing a lot of writing. So I'd be getting up in the morning, writing 2,000 or 3,000 words, researching, writing 2,000 or 3,000 words on the book, writing scripts for the documentary series, shooting off to China or South America, maybe on Monday after, do start the week, which is the radio show, which requires a lot of work. Finish start the week on sort of Monday late morning, rush to Heathrow, fly somewhere, film pieces to camera while writing bits of the book, while being driven around wherever I am. So working flat out, get back to London by Friday for time to be heavily and intensively briefed on Sunday's programme and start to prepare the interviews, do the Sunday programme, collapse, get up, do the Monday morning radio show, and then do the whole thing over again. And it was insane. It was a completely ridiculous way of working. But I was enjoying it. I was enjoying, who wouldn't be enjoying, taking around the pyramids when there's nobody else there, or going to the Great Wall of China, or going down to the Antarctic, all the places I went to. Fantastically interesting. And at the same time, interviewing the most interesting people. So Putin in that period, or shortly after that period, Obama, I was talking to all the interesting people. A great life, but I was hurtling forward far too fast. And I'd had not one, but I will say this, I'm sorry, because it's important public information, TIAs, which are like mini. Lots of people have them and don't notice them, don't quite know what they are. And if they did know and they went to hospital, they could stop themselves from having the really big stroke that I then had.
Right. So there were some warning signs.
There was in one case, I was in northern Greece, in the mouth of a cave at the place where, this is astonishing, Aristotle had his school where he taught Alexander the Great. Now, A, it's amazing Aristotle taught Alexander, but B, the fact that they actually know where the school was is mind-blowing. And it's to do with great archaeology and certain amount of post holes and this kind of. Anyway, it was the right place. And all I had to do that morning was stand up and describe this in front of a camera, which I was quite good at doing. And I stood up in the cave and the words wouldn't come. I just couldn't get the words out. And I felt utterly exhausted. And my cameraman took me back in his car, and I slept in the back of the car for 2 or 3 hours in this Greek village, and then kind of revived and eventually did the piece. And that was a mini stroke.
Right.
And that should have been a huge warning sign. I should have gone straight to hospital. And then a few weeks after that, I was driving home after seeing one of my daughters at Oxford, and I passed out in the car and hit the barrier of the motorway. The car went way up in the air, crashed down, and I got it back to the garage with the whole side of the car stove in. In fact, I only realised how bad the damage was because I tried to open the door to get out in the garage, and the door wouldn't open because it was all buckled.
Right.
So I was incredibly lucky. I didn't kill anybody else. I didn't kill myself. But that was another. I thought I was just exhausted. I was often exhausted, but it wasn't. That was almost certainly, the doctors tell me, another mini stroke.
Right.
So the warning signs had been there, and I had ignored them. I was going far too fast. I was under huge stress. Now, one of the things that had happened to me was I used to be a runner, and my knees and Achilles tendons had given up, so I couldn't run anymore. And that had been a way of relieving stress, as exercise often is. And so my wife very kindly got me a rowing machine to sort of, get the exercise going. And we had a little shed, and I'd been on the rowing machine. And like a lot of men of a certain age, I'd been a bit stupid about my target. So I was trying to do, I can't remember, but it was something like to row 5 miles in 40 minutes or whatever it might be at a certain gearing. It was something, one of my physios later said, that's what a a very fit professional athlete in their 20s should be heading for. You were mad. Anyway, I was doing that, and I can remember very vividly hitting my target and being pleased with myself, and immediately feeling very sick and dizzy, and seeing sort of flashing lights in front of my eyes, a little bit like that dazzle camouflage, you used to get on ships, or multicolored sort of flashes and sort of rhythmic light, and just feeling awful. And I was cooking the family meal that day. So I went into the kitchen, started to cook the meal, and all the rest of it just felt worse and worse and worse. And I thought it was a migraine. So when my wife Jackie came back, the kids came back and said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to join you for supper. I'm just feeling rotten. I think it's a migraine. And so I went and sat and watched TV. I went to bed, and I was sleeping in the back room in the house at that time because I was snoring a lot. And went there and woke up the next morning lying on the floor. And I can just remember feeling incredibly irritated, angry. Why am I? It's a really crap way to start a day. You wake up, you're on the floor, and I couldn't get off the floor. And that
no pain as such, just an inability to move. Yeah.
Absolute confusion about what was going on. And it took me, I guess, about 40 minutes to get up. And I couldn't work out why it was so difficult to get up. The reason was that I was paralyzed down the left side. But in a strange way, I didn't really notice that. And I got myself to the bathroom to get a shower. And I can remember going to the shower and being unable to lift my foot into the shower, thinking that's even weirder. And then I turned around and looked at the mirror, and I had that sort of a mouth that came right down at the side. So I realized, okay, so this is clearly a stroke. So I went in, woke up Jackie, and I think I've had a stroke. And she screamed and looked at me. And then after that, the ambulance arrived about an hour later. But the stroke had happened overnight, so it was really too late. And I was taken to the hospital. And what followed was pretty grim. But they saved my life. So,
We'll be right back after this. As regular listeners know, Crisis What Crisis is brought to you with a little help from Mindstream, a personal well-being music company designed to create those calmer moments in our hectic lives. Mindstream can really help put you back on track and guide you towards the mindfulness that we all need to function more effectively. And I can tell you from personal experience that it really works. Mindstream music is cleverly designed to help regulate your body's response to stressful situations by slowing your heartbeat and guiding you towards that more calmer state. They also have playlists to stimulate your brain, helping to keep you focused and engaged for longer periods of time. Getting your mindset right is the absolute key when you're navigating a crisis, or if you're just struggling with day-to-day pressures. You'll find them at mindstream.com. That's mind with a Y. They're also on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, wherever you download your music from. So take back some control and consider making a Mindstream playlist one of your crisis cures. I don't think you'll regret it. And now back to Andrew. You're taken to intensive care. I mean, you perhaps don't remember the conversations at the time, one imagines, but I mean, what was the prognosis? I imagine in those early stages, there was extreme concern about whether or not you would survive.
I can remember the following things. I can remember going in and a very nice doctor explaining that I had what they called a dissection or a tear in my carotid artery. Is what had caused it, and that to unblock the artery, they now had a thing like a tiny little submarine which would go into the arterial system, and it goes into your groin, and they push it up all the way through the arterial system, the heart and everything, until they get to the carotid artery, and then it unblocks the artery. And he said, the great thing about this is it'll take a long time, and it won't be very pleasant, because we can't give you kind of full painkillers and stuff. We have to know what's going on. You can't be knocked out. And it did take, by the way, about 2 to 3 hours, I think. He said, but the great thing about this is that we then don't have to use the unblocking drugs, because they can have catastrophic side effects. Right. And so we went through this thing. It went on and on and on and on and on. I can remember a sensation like having hot tea poured into the brain. You can suddenly hear you. Anyway, went on for hours and hours and hours, very uncomfortable. And I was sitting on this kind of metal tube while it was being done. And then at the end of it all, the doctor said, Mr. Marr, good news and bad news. He said, this bit hasn't really worked, I'm afraid. We haven't been able to do what we wanted to do. But don't worry, because we've got drugs that will work for you. And I can remember saying to him, are these the same drugs you told me could have catastrophic side effects? And there being a silence.
Goodness.
Anyway, I was then out cold, and all I know is that I came around not feeling great, probably about a day later. And in that period, my wife and kids had been taken into a room by the doctor, first of all, and told that I wasn't going to make it, to prepare themselves, that I wasn't going to make it. I was going to die.
They were told that?
They were told that. And then sometime afterwards, maybe the next day, they were told, well, we think he might well make it, but if he does, he'll be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, and we don't know how much cognition he'll have. Basically, I could have been a vegetable, and the wheelchair was the effect of what they were saying. So prepare yourselves for that. And so when I woke up and I was myself, they were pretty relieved. I wasn't talking very well, and I was completely paralyzed on one side, but it could have been an awful lot worse.
So the doctors were presumably staggered by your...
They were certainly pleased. They were certainly pleased.
And terrible trauma for Jackie and the kids in that interim period.
You know what? It was much worse for them than it was for me. I was just an object in a bed, and then I eventually, got better, and I started to read and draw and do all the things I do, and it was fine. This came in, but for them it was absolutely horrible.
What do you remember about your thought processes? What's going on? What's the sort of internal monologue at that stage for you when you're facing all this? Do you remember?
Do you know what? It's remarkably humdrum, I'm afraid, because once you don't know you're about to die, you don't feel you're about to die, you wake up and you haven't died. And the next thing you think is, I need to go to the loo, I'm bored, I'm a little bit hungry, and all those absolutely quotidian, mundane things kick in. So you're wondering about whether you can manage yet another vegetarian hospital curry, or do you have to find a new way of getting food into you? You're wondering about, can I make it to the loo and back without the nurse being in? And by holding on to all these things, you're wondering about, there's a lot of physio straight away. So you're exhausted by the physio. You're thinking about the rhythm of the physio. And then you're just thinking about entertaining yourself. So I was reading books, and I was watching lots and lots of DVDs, and I was constantly asking for more DVDs and more books. And the thing that I do to not de-stress, because it's more important to me than that, thing I do all the time is draw and paint. And so I had some drawing material, and I was drawing the ends of the bed and the foot and all the stuff around me. I was thinking about, what am I going to do in the next 5 minutes, not what is my human situation now.
So in those early days of recovery, what was the sort of long-term kind of prognosis? Because you've been left with paralysis on your left side, but at first your speech was quite badly affected. Obviously, a huge issue for you as a professionally. But what was the view of the doctors of what the long-term prognosis would be?
Well, they didn't tell me too much, which was probably a good thing. They said, we think we can get you walking again, but you're going to have to work hard at it. And so I spent a lot of the earlier period with a stick or a sort of Zimmer frame thing, staggering around, trying to learn to walk, going down to the gym, trying to move my left arm, which still, by the way, doesn't move very well. And one thing they did was brilliant. You talked about I had a speech therapist, but in the gym they rigged up an auto cue. So they got a TV, and they typed in various news headlines, and I practiced reading them out, which I thought was fantastic, brilliant. And the speech did come back, luckily for me, not perfectly ever, but pretty well.
But that's wonderful. I mean, rigging up the auto cue is obviously a very sort of practical help for you, but also how sort of emotionally intelligent for them to have done that, because that would absolutely have been, I assume, playing straight into your, one of your core fears. What's going to come next.
The ICU nurses and the physios were just amazing. They were wonderful. I mean, friendly, frank, nice people to be around. And of course, there's more COVID, so the NHS, I'm sure, is stressed. But at that stage, there was proper staffing. I was very lucky. I was in an ICU bed, so you were surrounded by all the right kit. But they were so friendly. And, within a few weeks, I was going up and down stairs, not safely and in a wobbly fashion, but I was moving around, going into the gym. and meeting all the other patients, which is, of course, very amusing because you get their stories too.
Yes.
I was in hospital for quite a long time. But
how long were you in hospital for?
I think 12 weeks, something like that, 10 to 12 weeks. Quite. People tell you, if you've been in hospital, you don't have to be in hospital for very long to get institutionalized. By the time I left, going out into the road outside the Charing Cross Hospital was quite not scary, but sort of weird. You thought, oh yes, the rest of the world still exists. Cars move quite fast, don't they? It was all very, very strange. Months and months and months of physio.
We had Martha Lane Fox, who I'm sure you know, on the podcast, and I'm sure you know her story. Terrible car accident that left her with permanent injuries. She told us that one of her coping mechanisms, and she is, as I say, a remarkable woman who will walk on stage with her cane and deliver a sort of brilliant no-notes speech. It's something to see. She told us that denial has been a very useful technique for her. It's not a very fashionable approach in this world these days, but one that absolutely works for her. I wonder if you've ever done the same. Have you just sort of pushed it to one side on occasions to be able to move forward?
I think that's very interesting. That's really interesting. Let me think about that. I think when I was coming out of the sort of first bit of physiotherapy, if I had sat down and looked analytically at what I would not be able to do, I might not have been able to cope. Running was important. I couldn't run. I can't run. Can't cycle. Though, in fact, I have learned to cycle, but I can't stop because I can't get my foot down to brace against the road. So you just fall over. So you can't cycle. Can't cycle, can't run. Can't really swim with one side of the body paralyzed. Can't ski. There are lots and lots of can'ts coming up all around me.
Yes.
And I don't think I could have coped with the thought that I couldn't work either, that I had no use in that respect. And so I always assumed I'd get back to work. There was no real reason why I should have been able to. I was on the edge of not being able to. And I had specific problems apart from mobility. My speech was pretty bad then. And weirdly, one of my lungs wasn't working very well. So if there was a long sentence, I couldn't get the air to the end of it. So I had to start recording the tops of the show because I would run out of puff otherwise. Lots of things like that. I have to say, in a world where we're told not to respect politicians and they're all ghastly and all the rest of it, David Cameron did me a huge favor. He agreed to be interviewed by me right at the beginning of my ability to be back on television. And I came into Number 10 and I interviewed him, and he was gracious enough to give me news lines. And it was all very successful. And from then on, the BBC, I think, thought, okay, he's going to be all right. They didn't think that all the way through, but they decided it was probably going to be okay for me to go back on screen. And I went back to work quite quickly. Not doing
when you look back on that period, then, well, what was the, because that you are clearly a fundamental optimist, and the work ethic, like a Jedi, is very strong in you, Andrew. Clearly, but what? There must have been those moments, and I'm sure there were several where you thought, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about those moments and how and what you did. What technique did you use, or what were you saying to yourself to pull yourself out of that place?
Well, I was very dogged. I am, a dogged, relatively hardworking person. I just made sure I was even better briefed than before. Gave myself a bit more time before and after the interviews to be preparing for them. And, I don't know, really, that was it. I think the work ethic is very strong in me. And I think the negative way of putting it is that I'm not very good at being by myself and doing nothing. I got to go to pieces quite quickly if there's not structures around me, if there isn't a purpose to the day, if there aren't a series of tasks to be accomplished. I'm a sort of slightly old-fashioned mechanical machine in that regard. I just have to get crunching through it. And the other thing I haven't really talked about much, but is incredibly important to me in this story, is art, because I might easily have become an artist if I hadn't become a journalist or a writer. And I ask myself if that wasn't really the better way forward. And so one of the big difficulties for me was I couldn't paint. I used to do landscapes and stuff outside. I'd get my easel and I'd go to the side of a field or into a wood and I'd paint. After the stroke, I couldn't do that. I couldn't carry the gear. I couldn't set it up. And if the wind came along and blew the canvas over, I couldn't pick it up again. I thought, oh, is painting going to go as well? And then I realized that, of course, I could paint inside in a studio. I could get myself a place to paint. I'm not really interested in painting flowers or nudes or whatever you can paint in the studio. And so I went back to something I've always been interested in, which is abstract painting, which is what I've got. Abstract painting and abstract drawing, certainly drawing every day now. And that was a very, very important ladder back to realize that, yes, there's all these can'ts, there's always big signs saying, don't go here, don't swim, don't do this, don't do that. But actually, there are other gates that you can open and walk through and do something that you weren't doing before the stroke and actually do it better.
Wonderful. Your dad, Donald, I think, was also a painter.
Yes, he was. He would be surprised to hear that. He did a bit of painting, but I was certainly brought up surrounded by the idea that painting was normal. He had friends who were painters. Near Dundee, where I come from, is actually a very artistic place. So it had a series of very, very fine painters, some of whom we knew. But you'd see them around town painting, outside, and you'd go to the exhibitions. I always went to the annual exhibition at the Royal Scottish Academy every year and other exhibitions. So I was brought up with the idea of painting being a thing.
Your father very sadly died during lockdown.
Yes.
He was clearly a big figure in your life. Always there at times of crisis, I'm sure, in your life. Was his voice pretty loud in your head during those days of difficulty that we've been discussing?
All the time. He suffered from diabetes, which he got relatively early in his life, in his 30s. And that comes with hypos and dangers of all kinds. So we grew up with the idea of having to overcome physical problems. He was just an inordinately kind, gentle and wise man. And his sort of sayings still float around my head if I'm negotiating a salary. He would always say, you've only got one stomach. In other words, you don't need that much. And he was quite Presbyterian in that regard. And in my career generally, I've always remembered something. He was quoting another person with a stronger Scottish accent, but he would also say, "There's a cure to our thing, but a swelled heat," and it's absolutely true. And
it is true.
Dad's sayings and his silly poems and so on were, and he was always a sort of warm presence, 500 miles north from where I was going through all this stuff, and I talked a lot.
Well, I'm very sorry. For what happened during lockdown. It must have been very difficult for you and for your family.
Like so many people, we did follow the rules, and he was buried in the village we come from, outside the church where he'd served as an elder for 56 years, but the church was locked and bolted. We could have none of his friends from the village, none of his friends from work, none of the wider family. There were 6 of us and the minister standing around the gravestone, the grave. We had a piper as well, and it was fine. We read some poems, but it was not the send-off that he deserved. And when I discovered or realized later that was the same week of one of the big Downing Street parties, the iron entered my soul a bit. I got very angry.
Yes. I've listened to some of your interviews, and you found that line between making that very clear, because that's really what this story is all about, isn't it?
Yep.
As well as remaining professional with it. I mean, a hell of a task given the upset that you suffered. Can we go back a couple of years? Let's go back from there to 2018, when you faced another health crisis, this time a cancer diagnosis.
Yes.
Tell us about that day, Andrew.
That was in a way less dramatic, because it was resolved quite quickly. I have always, for weird reasons, thought that stomach cancer or colon cancer we want. I don't know why, but I've always thought that's a particularly unpleasant one. So that's probably what I'll eventually get. And so I was having a scan of the sort of the thorax or whatever it's called. And they said, no sign of nothing in the lungs, nothing in the bowel. That's absolutely fine. There's something strange in one of your kidneys, and a little bean-sized thing in the kidney. And it was cancerous. And it's never good to hear that you've got a cancer diagnosis. But I am a relative optimist. I'm a glass half full person. And they said, we can deal with this quickly. And they did, with an extraordinary thing called, I can't quite remember, a something ablation, where basically they stick two tiny tubes in through the skin to the kidney, one to look at what's going on, and the other one to blast the cancer with freezing agent. So they freeze it down to some minus something extraordinary low temperature, and it dies, and it then breaks up and falls off, and it's just reabsorbed by the body and disappears. And that worked. It's an amazing piece of new technology. I think it was developed first in the Netherlands. But
was there a concern with the diagnosis, though, that because of your stroke, that your ability to recover from whatever treatment you'd have to have to deal with the cancer, that would be impaired in some way, or not?
Nobody ever said that, and I've been lucky enough not to have to go through chemo or anything like that, or radiotherapy. But no, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I've talked about that a bit in the past, because lots of people get cancer diagnoses. Lots of them have an absolutely horrible time. I've lost friends to cancer, as I'm sure you have, because we all have. And I've got friends who've got awful cancer problems right now. But this was just, as it were, a message to the rest of the world that you can get cancer and it can be fine and dealt with quite quickly.
Having already gone through so much, though, with that diagnosis, I mean, one assumes there must have been two thoughts in your head. One is, oh, really? After everything, this now? And the other, I suppose, is did it again cause you to look at the big picture in life, or about life? You've talked a little bit in the past about wanting to squeeze the juice out of every day, which I think is a wonderful expression. How did you find the balance between those two things? How did you keep yourself out of the former and focused on the latter?
I think the short answer is I learned nothing. I carried on, and I'm still carrying on. When I had my stroke, a friend came into who'd had a very bad stroke and written a book about it. Came in to see me in hospital, and he said, "Andrew, you must be crying the whole time with rage. With rage, you must look at all those people down there and think, you sods, I've had a stroke and you haven't. How dare you? How dare you? How dare you?" And I said, to be absolutely honest, Robert, it's never even occurred to me. I've never thought that way. I mean, what happens to me happens to me. What happens to you, and that's just life. And he looked visibly disappointed in my answer, and he said, "Well, you must just have cried sobs of self-pity. You must think, oh dear, poor me, poor me." And again, I said, glibly, I said, "I come from Dundee. We don't do that. That's never occurred to me." And he looked even more depressed. And the visit went on. Then he left the room. And then a few seconds later, he knocked on the door and came back in again. And he came over. He said, "Never forget the old stroke survivors adage, Andrew." And I said, "What's that, Robert?" He said, "It's the second stroke that kills you." So, I've always thought, as I said at the beginning, temperament is fate. And I have been blessed, frankly, with a relatively upbeat temperament and a short attention span, which keeps me working. Now, one day I'll work too much. One day I'll go too far. But for now, it's been pretty good.
Andrew, amazing. Look, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that's a wonderful place to bring the conversation almost to a close, because I want to use a little bit more time just to ask you for your crisis cures. So these are three things. Can't be another person is the only rule that you lean on. We've talked about the painting, so I'm not going to let you have that, I'm afraid. But try and give me three things that you keep in mind, or that you do. Maybe it's something specific, like a book or a particular piece of music or something that you lean on.
Well, if I can't have people, I would have mentioned my wife Jackie and my agent Mary as the people. If I can't have them and I can't have painting, then the low one, but it's real, is a good, fairly socking malt whiskey, lasting thing that absolutely calms me down. A really good peaty malt with half and half with water, looking into the middle distance is a fail-safe, brings the blood pressure down, puts everything in perspective. And if I can't have painting or drawing, I would say music, certainly. I listen to a lot of classical music. I go to the hall a lot and I listen to piano music. As I get older, I get fonder of classical music and piano music. And I would be walking around Regent's Park with headphones on, listening almost certainly to something, either Beethoven piano sonatas, or my new discovery is actually Haydn's piano sonatas, which are just heart-stoppingly beautiful. Third thing, if I'm allowed, is the sky. Get outside in all weathers. Be surrounded by the smells of nature. I live right by Regent's Park, so that's the nearest I can get there. But walking, being outside, music, and when necessary, a malt whiskey.
Wonderful. Andrew, thanks so much again for joining us today and for sharing your crisis stories. I think it's all been inspirational, frankly, and I've no doubt it will be of use to anyone who's listening to this and facing their own difficulties. So, sincere thanks to you.
I really hope so, Andy. Thank you very much indeed for that conversation. Much appreciated.